Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Matheson Museum. I'm Salvatore Cumella, the Executive Director. Thank you all for being here tonight. Just quickly, to let you know what our next program will be. Next week, we have The Traveling Canary in Alachua County with Terrence Ho. That's Wednesday, October 9th at 7 p.m. We do have his book for sale here in the gift shop if you're interested. It's a really nice book. A reminder that this program tonight, is sponsored in part by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, Florida, the City of Gainesville, and the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, and the State of Florida. Tonight, we're proud to host Carl Van Ness, who is a University Librarian Emeritus at the George A. Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida. He was employed as an archivist at the libraries for 38 years and held various titles, including University Archivist and Florida Political Papers Archivist. He also served as the university's historian from 2006 until his retirement in 2022. His book, The Making of Florida's Universities, Public Higher Education at the Turn of the 20th Century, was published by the University Press of Florida in 2023. This is Carl's second talk at the Matheson. His previous talk was on the origins of the Gator nickname. And join me in welcoming Carl Van Ness. Yeah.
Thank you, Sal, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's been an arduous week for everybody. Hopefully, does everybody have electricity? Anybody still not have electricity? Internet? Everybody has internet? No internet. I got my internet back 2 days ago. So anyway, we'll hang in there. Eventually, it'll be restored, I'm sure. My talk tonight is based on research for my recently published book, The Making of Florida's Universities, which sounds like it should be a history of higher education, but it's more of a political history than it is an educational history. In fact, I have little to say about curricular matters and even less about athletic matters. It's impossible, in my opinion, to separate politics from public education, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary. Throughout the state's history, political intrusion into higher education has been the norm, but we have been fooled by the periods when it was the exception. And for many of us, we remember how it was in the 1980s and 1990s when the government tried to stay out of higher education, but that's no longer true. Any history, in my opinion, any history of public higher education that ignores politics is not an accurate history. In other words, in my opinion, there is no ivory tower. But for tonight, we're only going to talk about one aspect of my book and try to answer the question, oops. Technical difficulties for this. Is it possible for you to do it just by me pointing at you and let's do that? Okay. Maybe I'll open up for questions right now. Any questions about what I just said? Yeah, I know. Right now? Oh, there we go. I will back up. For tonight, we're only going to talk about one aspect of my book and try to answer the question, why is the University of Florida in Gainesville? As a university historian, I would frequently be asked, what would Gainesville be like if the University of Florida was not here? And I always replied, that's easy. Get on I-75, go 45 miles north, get off at Lake City, because that's where the university used to be. So an alternative title to my talk might be, why is the University of Florida not in Lake City? In a very long list of dubious distinctions, Florida is the only state to abandon the campus of a state university and move it elsewhere. The reasons for not doing this, I think, should be obvious to everyone, but yet here we are and not in Lake City. What on earth led to this seemingly insane decision? What possessed the state's political leadership to forsake Lake City? Well, tonight I'm going to focus on what I consider to be the three most significant reasons for the move. And in the process, I'm going to debunk a couple of myths about the origins of the University of Florida. Reason number one, the Buckman Act of 1905. The move could not have happened had Florida not passed the Buckman Act. Reasons 2 and 3 are immaterial if reason number 1 doesn't happen. The Buckman Act is the focal point of my book. And if you want to learn more about the act and its repercussions, the relocation of the state university being only one of many, please read my book. For tonight, though, I will confine my remarks to the sections of the Buckman Act that made the move possible. But first, I need to explain what the act was all about. The Buckman Act bears the name of Henry Buckman, a state legislator from Jacksonville who was the principal author of the bill. Buckman and two other authors of the Buckman Act, Eugene Matthews of Stark and Edgar Wortman of Citra, appear in this photo, but don't ask me which one is which. I could not identify them. I will tell you this, Buckman had a mustache and he didn't have a beard, so that kind of narrows it down to about half of the men in the photograph. These are members of the House of Representatives. The Buckman Act came out of a joint Senate-House committee, so there were also state senators as well. The Buckman Act abolished. The phrase used in the act was abolished, revoked, and vacated 6 state-supported schools for white students that were, for the most part, high schools, if that. There was also a 7th school, but it never opened, so I don't count it. If you read 7, that's why. In 1905, Florida schools were, of course, racially segregated. Now, my book has several sections on the early history of Florida A&M, but for tonight, we're only concerned with the University of Florida during the period in which it was a school for white men. The 6 or 7 schools that were abolished, revoked, and vacated were replaced by 2 ostensibly new schools, a college for white women and a university for white men. This is Warren McNair from nearby Archer. He was a cadet at the East Florida Seminary in Gainesville, one of the 6 schools that were abolished, revoked, and vacated. He was 13 when the photo was taken in 1903. By today's standards, little Warren here would be in the 8th grade, but things were much different in 1903. And Warren was lucky still to be in school at the age of 13. Most boys left school long before the 8th grade. And this was true throughout the Deep South, not just in Florida. Girls, on the other hand, tended to linger in school longer than boys. There was usually no incentive for them to enter the workforce, and 13 is too young to get married, of course. Outside the South, though, the high school movement was in full swing. And children were staying in high school much longer than they had been in the 19th century, and often right through the 12th grade, as they do today. But Florida was still stuck in the 19th century in 1905, and it needed a jolt to enter the 20th century. The Buckman Act provided that jolt. According to Henry Buckman, the purpose and intent of the act was to eliminate what he characterized as a separate set of high schools that had become, in his words, an incubus on the state's educational system. He further argued that the local high schools needed to be the feeders for the state colleges. Prior to Buckman, there were only about 2 or 3 senior high schools in the state of Florida. First was Duval High School in Jacksonville. That was followed by Pensacola High School. And then the third one was probably Hillsborough High School. Most school districts relied on the state-supported schools to avoid funding secondary education beyond the 8th grade. So for example, if you were a parent of a 13-year-old, say in Palatka, Florida, and you wanted your parent to, you wanted your child to go further, the school district would say, okay, well, he or she can go to the East Florida Seminary or one of the other state schools. There was no tuition, and the only thing you had to pay would be room and board. After Buckman, local school districts were compelled to raise millage rates to support secondary education, and high school enrollment increased steadily in the 1910s and 1920s. The Buckman Act also required a 12th grade education for admission to the college, but that requirement could not be implemented until 1913. There were simply not enough high school students in the state of Florida. Now, Florida did not compile statistics on 12th grade enrollment until 1914. However, in a survey conducted in 1908 by University of Florida President Andrew Sled, he found that there were only 91 white male students in the 12th grade. He did not survey female students because he wasn't interested in female students because they couldn't attend the University of Florida. But we know that there were more girls than boys, so we could approximate that there were probably around 200 12th graders in the year 1908. In 1914, enrollment in the 12th grade had risen to 582. And then after World War I, the numbers skyrocketed. And you can see here, 1919, it had risen to 1,215, 1923, 2,613, and then 1927, all the way up to 5,784. This is only for public schools. There were, of course, private schools in the state of Florida as well. By comparison, Black enrollment in 1919 was only 29. In 1923, 43. And then in 1927, 171 students in the 12th grade. The expansion of secondary education is what Henry Buckman intended, and it was the one unqualified success of the Act. Other aspects of the Buckman Act were less or not at all successful. Now, if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Buckman Act, or to other sources on the Buckman Act, you'll find an entirely different explanation for the Buckman Act. There is this myth that the primary purpose of the Buckman Act was to create a system of higher education, and that the pre-Buckman schools merged to create what would become the University of Florida and Florida State. However, the word merged does not appear in the Buckman Act. The schools were instead abolished, revoked, and vacated. Furthermore, no one in 1905 is talking about a merger or making any efforts to merge. Instead, the president of the University of Florida, Andrew Sled, was preoccupied with the fundamental question of whether or not his university still existed, and if it did, was he still its president? This raises the question, were all of the state schools truly abolished, revoked, and vacated? It might seem they were, that's what it says, but the Florida Supreme Court said otherwise in 1909. In 1905, Florida had 2 public schools that offered college diplomas. One was the Florida State College in Tallahassee, and the other was the University of Florida in Lake City. Florida State began as the West Florida Seminary in 1857 and became the Florida State College in 1901. The University of Florida opened in 1884 as the Florida Agricultural College and became the University of Florida in 1903. It was a land-grant college and subsisted largely off of federal funds, not state funds, until 1901. And in 1901, there was a progressive governor, Governor Jennings, who really wanted to promote higher education and began funding the university in Lake City. Most people in 1905 assumed that the 2 existing colleges would survive as the two new colleges. And in fact, the Florida State College did become the Florida State College for Women and is now FSU. This assumption was validated by the Florida Supreme Court in 1909 in a case involving the executor of the Westcott Trust, George Lewis of the Lewis State Bank. Mr. Lewis is the gentleman outside the car, the older gentleman with the straw hat. He's talking to John Henderson. John Henderson was the brother-in-law of Albert Murphy, who was the last president of the pre-Buckman Florida State College and the first president of the post-Buckman Florida State College. And he was our University of Florida's second president, becoming president in 1909. The car is a Lincoln, and it was very expensive. So obviously, John Henderson had a lot of money. Prior to the Buckman Act, the Florida State College had been receiving the earnings from a trust created by Judge James Westcott. And if you've ever been to Florida State, you've probably seen Westcott Hall, their administration building. In 1905, George Lewis reasoned as the Buckman Act had abolished, revoked, and vacated the Florida State College, he was now free to disperse the funds as he saw fit. And he didn't see fit to give them to Florida State. The state took him to court, and it was finally resolved by the Supreme Court in a 3-2 decision that noted it was not the intent of the state legislature to abolish the Florida State College, and that the Florida State College for Women was the logical and legal successor. The court also noted that the legislature did not intend to abolish another school, which unfortunately they didn't actually name in the court decision, but it was most certainly the University of Florida. In the case of the University of Florida, though it may have been abolished and revoked, it was not have been abolished and revoked, it was most certainly vacated. Now, the point I want to make here is that the two schools already existed before Buckman. Furthermore, the other 4 schools that did not survive contributed very little to the 2 that did survive. They did not contribute faculty. They did not provide college students because their students weren't of college age. And most importantly, the legislature did not funnel money from those schools to the 2 colleges. Where did that money go? I don't know. Who knows? Nobody knows. Now, that is not to say that the Buckman Act did not impact public higher education. It certainly did, but not necessarily in a positive way. For one, the act ended coeducation for white students. You can add that to your list of dubious distinctions. While the nation, including the South, was moving towards coeducation, Florida is moving in the opposite direction. And before Buckman, we had coeducational opportunities. After Buckman, it's for white students, it's strictly gender segregated. The act also failed to clearly define who governed higher education, resulting in conflicts and chaos. But those are topics for another lecture. Before I go on, I want to follow up on the Lewis story. So in 1909, the court makes this decision and says that he has to pay the money to Florida State. So Lewis comes up with a new angle. He says, there is no money, and there's no money left in the trust. Everybody knew this was a bunch of malarkey. So the state, once again, has to take him to court. They threatened him with actual contempt of court. And I believe it was in 1915, 1916, they made a deal with George Lewis. They said he could keep his ill-gotten gains, all the money that he accrued from 1905 to whenever the decision was made, but in turn, Lewis had to turn the trust over to the state of Florida. Upon receiving the trust, the state of Florida realized that even prior to 1905, George Lewis had been shortchanging Florida State. Prior to 1905, he was dispersing about $2,000 to Florida State, and then they realized it should have been more like $4,000. So that's the story behind the Westcott Trust. On to reason 2. Hmm. Ah, okay. Reason two, the city of Gainesville decided to put up a fight. The Buckman Act did not specify where the two new schools would be located. That decision was left to the 5 men of the Florida Board of Education and the 5 men of the Florida Board of Control. The members of the Florida Board of Education were all elected officials, and they included the governor, the state treasurer, the attorney general, the secretary of state, and the superintendent of public construction. The Board of Control was a new entity actually created by the Buckman Act to administer the two colleges, as well as the State Normal and Industrial School, which is now FAMU, and the State School for the Deaf and Blind in St. Augustine. The members of the Board of Control were appointed by the governor and were not active politicians like the State Board of Education. Despite the prevailing belief in Gainesville and elsewhere that the University of Florida would remain in Lake City, Gainesville's civic leaders decided to make a bid for the university. Led by Mayor William R. Thomas, picture here, and thank you, Michelle Wilbanks, for finding this photograph for me. Gainesville launched a surprisingly effective PR campaign that included a massive letter and telegram operation that targeted the 10 men of the two boards. They would be receiving letters from all over the state and telegrams from all over the state. In some cases, though, the telegrams were all sent from one location, and the city of Gainesville was paying somebody to send these telegrams. He would sign other people's names to the telegram. So it was a very clever campaign. There was also a media blitz, and the media blitz resulted in several newspaper endorsements, including one from the Tampa Tribune, which had previously stated it would be folly to move the university. Lake City, on the other hand, did not engage in a public campaign as it thought it unnecessary to do so. There we go. The University of Florida was already in Lake City, and it seemed unfathomable that the state would move it. Even more so because Florida had invested heavily in Lake City in the years leading up to the Buckman Act. The campus was expanded from 100 acres to 300 acres. A new science hall was finished in 1903, and a gymnasium had been built with an endowment from Henry Flagler. And you can see the science hall here, it's on your left, and in the background is the Flagler Gymnasium. A modern brick and mortar dormitory was under construction when the Buckman Act was passed and was used only 1 year before the university was moved to Gainesville in 1906. All told, the capital invested in Lake City came to approximately $200,000. And that was the equivalent of the first 4 buildings built at Gainesville. And that would have been Buckman, Thomas, Newell, and Flint. The University of Florida at that time was and still is a land grant college, and there were about 100 acres of experimental agricultural fields. You can't move those. Then there was the expense of moving the campus, which was not covered in the Buckman Act because the authors of the Buckman Act didn't think they were actually going to move the campus. And of course, the cost of building a new campus. How was Florida, which was one of the poorest states in the nation, going to pay for that? There was also the disruption that a move would have on the faculty and students. In other words, Lake City thought they were safe. The two boards met on July 5th, 1905 to make their decision. Both towns made their presentation bids, and the bids were remarkably similar. Lake City offered $40,000 in cash, an 11-acre addition to the existing 300 acres, and 800 acres of land valued at $20,000 that could either be used or sold. Plus, if Lake City wasn't chosen, the state of Florida was obligated to return $15,000 to Lake City that they had used to purchase the university in 1883. Gainesville offered 517 acres, $70,000 in cash, and free water. After hearing the offers and presentations, the two boards closed the doors to the public, discussed the proposals for about 2 hours, and then voted 6-4 to move the university to Gainesville. Telegrams were quickly sent to both towns, and of course, there was a great celebration in Gainesville, doom and gloom in Lake City. No record of the discussion was kept, and the votes were kept secret. Now, you may have heard that Gainesville was selected because of the offer for free water. And here's the source of the free water, Bulware Springs, which, by the way, there's more talk of it being renovated again, so hopefully that'll get done soon. Raise your hand if you've heard the story that the University of Florida came because of free water. Okay, that's a lot of people. Well, I'm here to tell you that there is very little to support that notion. But the myth has been repeated so many times that it's become an urban legend. The source of the myth was William Knott, who was the state treasurer, and he was a member of the State Board of Education, who, when asked some 40 years after the decision was made why he voted for Gainesville, he cited the free water, along with Gainesville being more central in its offer of an unencumbered campus. In other words, they wouldn't have to deal with all those messy buildings in Lake City. That seems ironic, given that Lake City considered the existing buildings to be its main asset, but they were apparently, according to him, encumbrments. So if it wasn't free water, what was the real reason for the move? Reason number 3, you got trouble in Lake City. And my book does mention a pool hall. For those of you unfamiliar with what this is from The Music Man, and the number is called You Got Trouble in River City. And the source of the trouble in River City was the pool hall. I would love to turn the GIF off, but I don't know how. So just put up with that for a while. Problems in Lake City began soon after the college opened in 1884. The first conflict to attract the public's attention occurred in 1893, and then things cascaded downward from there. Writing in 1897, Tom Macbeth, editor of the Florida School Exponent, which was the journal of the Florida State Teachers Association, had this to say: "The State Agricultural College is exceedingly unfortunate, either in its location or its management. An institution that might and should have been the glory and pride of the state, it has almost from the very beginning been a shame and a reproach to the whole Commonwealth. Almost from the day of its establishment down to the present writing, it has been prominently before the public only through the noise and clamor of its disgraceful wranglings. Like a Central American republic, it manifests its continued existence chiefly through its periodic revolutions." Now, what were the causes of these periodic revolutions? Conflicts on college campuses in the 19th century were fairly common. Most uprisings stemmed from faculty members who were upset with the university president or the board of trustees, or maybe both. This Lake City, wasn't unusual in that sense. What was unusual, though, was for the town folks in Lake City to get involved in the conflicts and then take sides. And they always took the side of the faculty against the president. One president, Thomas Tolliver, referred to the malcontents in Lake City as the clique in town. Furthermore, on at least 2 occasions, the conflicts did not arise on campus, but were instigated by the clique in town. So how bad was it? Well, let me read from a letter. This is a letter written by Mayor Thomas to Governor Broward, and he's telling Governor Broward why the state of Florida has to get out of Lake City. "From the day of its establishment," this is going to sound very familiar, "from the day of its establishment up to the present moment, The university has been reeking with slander and torn by strife and dissension until a large majority of the people of Florida have become disgusted and prejudiced against it. And he lists off all these scandals that happened. Added to the Clute scandal, the DePass muddle, the faculty rebellion last year, the Sled-Marion fisticuffs this last year, the recent report of the legislative committee has sunk deep into the hearts and minds of the people. Mark my words, Captain Broward, if you undertake to establish a university on that heap of educational ruins, though you may live long, you will not live long enough to be proud of your work, but on the other hand, it will, in my opinion, candidly, frankly, but confidentially expressed to you as a friend, be a thorn in your flesh as long as you live. Sounds like hyperbole, but it wasn't. All the incidents that Thomas mentioned in my book, and some, like the physical alteration between President Sled and the history professor, Professor Marion, were amusing, but most were not. Most were tragic. But the last one needs special attention as it directly impacted the decision to relocate the university. So prior to each legislative session, the state legislature would send out teams of legislators to investigate certain matters. They might send a group out to inspect the roads, another hospitals, another the prisons, and they would always send a team to inspect the state schools. The reports rarely had anything negative to say about the schools, but instead emphasized the obvious needs of the schools. However, the 1905 report was different, and it painted a picture of incompetence and malfeasance at the university. The principal source for the legislators' report was, as you might guess, the clique in town. In particular, two legislators from Lake City. Now imagine this, two legislators from Lake City are talking to these three legislators and explaining to them how bad it is at the University of Florida. Now, to be fair to these gentlemen, the Buckman bill had not been submitted, much less passed, when the investigation team arrived in Lake City. Their aim was not to undermine the university, but to cause trouble for President Sled, who had been in Lake City for less than a year, but he had already incurred the wrath of the clique in town. By the time the report was published, the Buckman Act had been passed, and now the Lake City's claim to the university was in question. The report caused quite a stir, so much so that a member of the Board of Trustees for the University of Florida in Lake City, Frank Harris, defected and came out in support of Gainesville. He had seen enough. And here is what he had to say. Lake City has permitted the institution to become mixed up in its local politics and factional fights, and the university's usefulness has been hampered and at times almost paralyzed. He then cited the legislative report and noted that all the college presidents, Kern, Clute, Yoakum, Tolliver, Sled, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in turn had to pass through the furnace. So, was the unrest in Lake City the ultimate reason for the university's relocation? Well, I'm going to let President Andrew Sled have the final word here. This was submitted in a report to the General Education Board. The General Education Board was the leading philanthropic organization in the South providing money for education. It's backed by the Rockefellers and other affluent people. So these are very important people, and SLED has to explain to them why the state of Florida would do something as bizarre as abandon its campus and move it somewhere else. The chief reason for the surrender of the old university and transfer, even at considerable loss to Gainesville, seems to me to have been the generally prevailing opinion that it would be impossible to make a really great institution in the atmosphere of Lake City, that the town was not and could not be a suitable place for the proper development and expansion of the institution, owing to certain local conditions which would be needless to detail, and that to make Lake City the site of this new and larger university would be to invite failure at the onset. This, I say, seems to have been the argument for removal, although other reasons doubtless contributed to the same result. In closing, I would like to do something that professional historians are not allowed to do and engage in some speculative and hypothetical history. I can do this because I don't have a PhD. Boyd Murphy, who succeeded me as the Florida Political Papers archivist, has a PhD. He's going to be speaking here in a couple of weeks. Boyd, you're not allowed to do this. Okay. So what if the Buckman Act had not been passed? Would there be a college in Gainesville, and what might it look like? For that, we could head to our border state, Georgia, which followed a different path than Florida. Georgia, like Florida, had a bunch of subcollegiate institutions, inferior schools, but unlike Florida, it did not abolish those schools, but sustained them and gradually elevated them to colleges and universities. So if we continue our earlier trip up I-75, everybody's favorite highway, past Lake City, we arrive at Valdosta, the site of Valdosta State University, which began as a normal school. Normal schools were teachers' colleges, but in the early part of the 20th century, normal schools were not colleges. You didn't need a college degree to become a teacher. In fact, that would have been silly to have a BA or a BS and teach in a school. It began as a normal school, then it became a junior college, and it became a four-year college, and now it's a state university. If you go past Valdosta, we come to Tifton. And many of you have probably done this. You've driven right through Abraham Baldwin College. And you probably asked yourself, what is Abraham Baldwin College? I know I did many times. I looked it up. It was formerly an agricultural high school. Agricultural high schools were very popular in the 19th and 20th century. But it too was elevated to first a junior college and now a four-year college. Now, if we go past Tifton, all the way to Macon, get off I-75 at Macon, go to Milledgeville, which is the antebellum capital of Georgia, you'll find what is now the Georgia College and State University. But it began as the Women's College for Georgia. Have anybody been there before? Anybody in Milledgeville? Okay. It's a really small but really beautiful campus. My wife and I were there about a year ago. We walked through in about 10 minutes. But it's a really nice campus, and Milledgeville just drips Southern charm. It's one of those old Southern towns. And if you happen to go to Milledgeville, my wife and I could recommend Bollywood tacos if you want it for lunch. Okay, let's go all the way up to North Georgia, to Dahlonega, and I hope Dahlonaga's doing okay. I haven't heard any reports concerning Dahlonega, but it's up in the mountains. And it is the site of what is now the Dahlonega campus of the University of North Georgia. There are three campuses, and it's one of them. But it began as a military school. Every state in the South had at least one military school. Some states had two or three military schools, maybe four or five. But Dahlonega started as a military school. And it's a lot like Milledgeville in that it's a small town, and the campus is right there in the middle of town. If Florida had taken the same path as Georgia, it's possible that the East Florida Seminary in Gainesville would have evolved in something similar to the schools at Milledgeville or Dahlonega. We might have a small college in the middle of town, right, probably just across the street, with about 6,000 to 8,000 students. There would be no football weekends. If the school did play football, it's probably in Division III. Fewer Greek houses, of course, no medical complex. And of course, most of us wouldn't be here. So I'd probably be in Lake City at the University of Florida, or I might be at Florida State University. So I'm going to leave it there, open it up to questions and maybe speculation as to what Gainesville would be like without the University of Florida. Yes. There's a separate. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Go ahead. Yes.
Well, thank you for coming. Everything you said is very interesting. Many of it's novel. East Florida Seminary, established when? 1903, you said?
No, it was established in 1853.
Okay, that was
the date on the university's seal.
right. Okay, and that of course becomes the University of Florida.
No, that's what I'm saying. It
Okay,
did become the University of Florida.
that's what I'm so confused about.
There really was a University of Florida. So The myth concerning the merger ties into the decision in 1935 by President Tigert to change the date on the university seal. Prior to 1935, the date was 1905, the year of the Buckman Act.
Okay.
But he didn't think that was good. He didn't want to be the president of a young university. So he asked a couple of people to create an argument for an earlier date. Dean Truslin did some research, and he found that Supreme Court case I talked about in 1909. And he reasoned that, okay, Florida State, if the West Florida Seminary became the Florida State College and became Florida State College for Women, then we could make the same argument for the East Florida Seminary.
How did Lake City originally get picked to have the university? Was it just any other small town? Because it didn't seem to be a place to be logically picked. It wasn't exactly in between exactly San Augustine and Tallahassee or something like that.
Yeah.
And when you hear Lake City, it's a small town.
Yeah. They were all small towns. Gainesville
Okay.
was a small town too. That was one of President Sled's chief complaints. They kept locating the university in a small inland town.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted the university to be in Jacksonville. But Lake City was chosen. That's an interesting story because the charter for the land grant college was in 1870 during Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until 1883 that they chose Lake City. So there's like a 13-year period where there's a land grant fund, but the state of Florida is not using its land grant money. Why did they choose Lake City? Originally, they chose Gainesville, but Gainesville couldn't come up with the money. Then they chose a place called Eau Gallie, which is now part of the city of Melbourne.
East Coast.
Yeah, East Coast, city of Melbourne. And that one almost happened. I mean, they built the campus, they laid out roads, they sent out brochures saying that the college was going to open in 1877. What happens in 1877? Reconstruction ends.
Right.
And the land had been donated by a Republican, Henry Gleason. And the people who took over in 1877, the so-called Redeemers, they didn't want anything to do with this land that had been donated by Henry Gleason. So they said, no, we're not going to go there. And then it took them a long time. Gainesville put in another bid, as did Tallahassee, but then they finally decided on Lake City, probably because they gave them $15,000 to locate there.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So did the railroads play a role in the location here? Because I understand that was important in terms of this becoming the county seat. And also somebody had said that over at Roper Park was an original location at the Methodist church there.
Yeah, the classroom building for the East Florida Seminary still exists. It is at the First Methodist Church. It's Epworth Hall. So if you want to know what the East Florida Seminary looked like, that is it. That is the one that is a single classroom building.
And it's still there.
It's still there. It's one of two pre-Buckman buildings that still exist. The other one is in Bartow, which had been the site of the State Florida Military College. Railroads, not really. In fact, both Lake City, when they were competing, they both claimed to have better railroad connections, but actually both cities were, well, at least Lake City could say it was on the main east-west route, but by 1905, Gainesville is well off the main route for the railroads. Gainesville was originally situated on the first railroad, the Florida Railroad, but by that time the Florida Railroad had been bypassed, and it was no longer a central route. So there are probably people here who might even remember when the railroad chains came into town. They came in frontwise, the engine first, but then they had to back up to Waldo in order to get to the main line, which was at Waldo at that time. So railroads were not a big factor. No. Yes. Thank you. In fact, I have written down here on my sheet of paper, frequently asked questions. What happened to the campus at Lake City? So immediately after the decision was made, there were a couple of interesting proposals. The first one came from Nathan Bryan, who was the chair of the Florida Board of Control. His idea was to move A&M to Lake City, which would have been a serious upgrade for FAMU, because at that time this was called the State Normal and Industrial School. It consisted of a hodgepodge of wooden buildings. The dormitory for the men had no sanitary accommodations, as they say. They still used outhouses. It was really deplorable. And it would have, like I said, been a major upgrade for them if they had moved to Lake City and gone to that campus. That didn't happen. Andrew Sled and William Bennett, who was the last principal of the State Normal School for white teachers in Defuniak Springs, which is one of the state schools abolished, they had an idea, which was to establish a branch campus of the University of Florida in Lake City. The Buckman Act actually allowed this. It had to be a normal school. It would have been a coeducational normal school, but the otherwise all-male University of Florida. But it would have been in Lake City as a branch campus. The Florida Board of Control liked the idea. The Florida Board of Education did not, and they got their way. So that didn't happen. Eventually, they found a college for the campus. There was a schism in the Southern Baptist Conference in Florida. At that time, Lincoln Hawley was president of Stetson University, and he was secularizing the curriculum there. And there were a lot of Southern Baptists who didn't like that. They wanted a real Baptistic curriculum. And so there was a split off, and they established a college, a Baptist college at that campus. It lasted for about 10 years. It was called Columbia College. Then after that, it went bankrupt in 1919. The campus was vacant for a while, and in the 1930s, it became a veterans hospital. And the current Veterans Hospital in Lake City is on the campus of the old University of Florida, but none of the buildings exist anymore. The last building was torn down in the 1970s. So yeah, there's a plaque there somewhere. If you go to the Veterans Hospital, somewhere on the ground, there's supposedly a plaque saying where the University of Florida used to be.
We have to be careful with this mic because I don't know if any of it's coming across on Zoom or not, but I'm Robert Mounts, the current board president, and one of our, Chris Matheson was mayor of the city of Gainesville from 1910 to 1918. He was single, graduate of the Citadel, and but had studied to be a lawyer, and he was not yet married to Sarah. That came much later when they met in Oklahoma. But I'm wondering if you know what, if any, role he played as mayor in that period, 1910, 1918.
No, I really couldn't tell you. I'm not familiar with his career as mayor. And I don't know if he played any role in if he was on the team of people who managed to convince them to move the campus to Gainesville. Besides the mayor, Barney Colson, who was a prominent businessman in Gainesville, he played a key role on that committee. So there were a number of leading citizens who played an important role. Sure.
He mentioned railroad, and he mentioned the railroad. They did it with time.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, it is said, I don't know this right, it is said that there were hurricane specials. I'm not talking about the one we just had. I'm talking about trains. The hurricane specials would run every other year when the University of Miami, back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, would play Florida at Gainesville. And those hurricane specials would come all the way up from Miami, from the campus, 20 cars long. They'd park at the Seaboard Freight Station, which was at University Avenue and Waldo Road. Building was built in the 40s and unfortunately was torn down during the early 80s. They would back in from Waldo, the way he's talking about. They would back in from Waldo, and they would wait there like 18 cars each until the game was over. Then the buses would meet them in the parking lot at the Florida Field, run them back to the train. It was supposed to be one of the greatest drinking fests of all time, win or lose. These poor guys, they didn't know where they were, on the train or on the plane, Anyway, there's great stories about it. Have you or anybody ever seen pictures of those trains? That's what I wanted to find out.
I'm not familiar with any of them. There's another story I've heard where one year somebody got a car, railroad car, and managed to get it on campus.
Hmm.
So you talk about tailgating,
Right, right.
tailgating experience.
Wow.
They had their own car, railroad car
I-
on campus.
I-
There were railroad tracks in campus.
They were on
Obviously,
campus. They
to
used to
get
go on
supplies
campus.
in and
Right,
stuff like that.
right. I've heard that story.
Yeah,
A lot of good stories. Thank you.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, Miami was one of our major rivals, and uh, there was a lot of the state legislature even got involved in the athletics at the University of Florida, and because Miami kept beating us for a while, and so they wanted to give the state legislature wanted to give University of Florida more money, so we'd have more money for the football team. Uh, in the early years of the campus, our principal rival, out of state rival, was Mercer College in Macon, because one, there was a good railroad connection between here and Mercer, and also because both colleges were about the same size. So, any other questions? Well, thank you very much. If I may, there's a couple of other stories. I didn't talk about the Flagler Gymnasium at Lake City. Do anybody know the story behind the Flagler Gymnasium at Lake City? Okay, in 1902, Henry Flagler's wife was mentally incapacitated. She was in an institution in New York. The state of New York and the state of Florida did not allow anyone to divorce a spouse who was mentally incapacitated. He got the state of Florida to change its laws. He got his divorce. 2 years later, the state of Florida went back to the original law. And in return, as a reward, he paid for the gymnasium and also the equipment in the gymnasium. And there's also, it's never been proven, but supposedly he had left money in his will for the old University of Florida at Lake City. But when the campus was moved, which included his gymnasium, he rewrote the will. So now I don't know if the people in Lake City knew that, but if they knew that, they could have probably used that as a way to keep the university. Oh, thank you. Schizophrenic. Okay. Yeah, I know she was institutionalized. Yeah. 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 Yes. Was that wife 3 or 2? Alice is 2. Okay. And then the new wife is number 3. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
New wife is Mary Keene. Mary Keene.
Ah. All right. Good. Thank you.